All right. Hello, everyone. I have here in my hands the collected short stories of Bruno Schulz. Bruno Schulz, collected stories. This collection was translated from the Polish by Madeline G. Levine. There are two full collections here, Cinnamon Shops and The Sanatorium Under the Hourglass. And then there are 4 other stories that are titled under the heading Other Stories. The Cinnamon Shops, which is the title of some volumes published in English volumes of short stories by Schulz. Cinnamon Shops is the title of one of the chapters or one of the stories in the first group, and another story in that group is called The Street of Crocodiles, and that title is also used if you look for Bruno Schulz's works in English. The Street of Crocodiles is also used as the title of some published volumes. Those two, as I said, they're stories both in the same group that show up here in this volume in the first sub-collection. I would recommend this writer and these stories, especially if you want to explore unique, unconventional ways of observing and describing. If you want a writer of fiction who has a very creative, unusual way of describing things that really blurs the boundary between how we describe animate objects and how we describe inanimate objects. Because we have, tacitly, implicitly, we adopt conventions, ordinary ways that we apply, both how we pay attention to objects and how we describe, how we observe. And we do those observations differently. We describe differently if something is a table or chair versus when it is an animal, a pet, a human person. But if you break those conventions, you pay attention to these things differently, you kind of misapply, you intentionally, purposefully misapply how you pay attention, how you describe a category of things. So with that misapplication, with kind of quote-unquote transgression, you reveal things that are ordinarily unattended, ignored. For example, just talking about the first story, August, in the first collection here. Imagine that you're describing how you're walking down the street and you as a person or one is moving down the street. You're moving along the street, and as you keep moving, the mood of the street might change, and you could attribute those changes to the way you're progressing, the way things are different in different places along this path. We normally would not attribute the movement to the street itself, but this is something that one of the many things that Bruno Schulz does. He switches the source of movement and the source of change. Suddenly we adopt a different way of paying attention. So he writes, so along the street, a couple of houses more, and the street could no longer maintain its urban decorum. Like a fellow who, returning to his native village, sheds his city elegance along the way, slowly changing into a ragged peasant the closer he gets to his village. So the street is moving. The street is shedding its urban decorum, the elegance, the city elegance along the way, slowly changing into a ragged peasant the closer he gets. The real characteristic of the street, the real characteristic is revealed the deeper you go down the street, but the street itself is transforming. One other little passage that I selected, I wanted to read with you, again from just the first story, is a description of the narrator's aunt. The kind of mood, the general mood that she has. We read, quote, "My aunt complained. That was the basic tone of her conversations. The basic tone of her conversations. The voice of that white and fecund flesh already expanding lushly as if beyond the boundaries of her person, only loosely controlled in concentration, in the constraints of individual form, and already multiplied, even in this concentration, ready to distend, to disintegrate, to discharge into a family. It was an almost self-generating fecundity, femaleness deprived of breaks and pathologically rampant. And truly, all her complaints against her husband, against the servants, her worries about the children were only the capriciousness and sulking of unsated fecundity, a continuation of the surly, irate, and tearful coquetry that she visited in vain upon her husband. So this is like a very vivid image of, maybe you have had family members like this, or people that you've met who seem to have this emotional disposition, this feeling that they are ready to react with, they're ready to express this feeling, and it doesn't really necessarily have anything to do with what is in front of them. You see that they frequently get angry, or they frequently get upset, or they frequently start to celebrate and feel happy and joyful. But it's not that they are responding to what they're encountering, but instead they're looking for, they're searching in what is in front of them, an excuse. They're looking for an excuse, a reason to express this thing that Schulz described as the basic tone of their conversation. So we are currently with my Saturday reading group. We are going through these stories. We had our second session this afternoon, discussing mannequins, a treatise on mannequins, and that itself is divided into 4 parts. Talking about the way of describing, the transgressive way of observing that I attributed to Bruno Schulz. I also happen to be reading this short and sweet book by Johanna Oksala, How to Read Foucault. Very relevant to this topic. In describing Foucault's way of thinking about literature, she writes, Foucault wrote in the order of things that literature formed a sort of counter-discourse, freed from the principles of order that regulated scientific as well as everyday discourse. So, going against not just conventional ways of talking in science, but also in everyday discourse. Its aim, the aim of literature, was precisely to transgress the limits of discourse, to make them visible and contestable, debatable, and to discover a madness in language as that formless, mute, unsignifying region where language can find its freedom. And madness is exactly, this kind of madness is exactly what Bruno Schulz gives us in the figure of his father, the father that shows up and keeps showing up, returns in different ways, in slightly different moods, giving long speeches, and there's a madness in his tone. But in that madness, there's reason, and there's revolt, and there is a challenge to the dominant discourse, and a signifying act to that region of language that, as Foucault, as Oksala, describe as the region where language can find its freedom. So that particular kind of freedom from conventional ways of observing and describing, it's a perfect place to engage with it in Bruno Schulz's short stories. Thanks for listening.